Before we start, I would like to give a shout out to a channel called Vortex FN. He makes content about Among Us and Fortnite. He also posts quite frequently, and so if you're interested in gaming, please do subscribe to his channel. Okay, now that we're done with that, let's get started. By the 1830s, most of the Indian subcontinent was controlled by the East India Company. Other kingdoms were vassals and allies. Many of the Indian locals were taxed heavily and discriminated by the British. However, the East India Company still had some problems with the Sikh Empire. The Sikh Empire was led by Maharaja Ranjit Singh. However, when he died, the Sikh Empire succumbed to the East India Company. However, things changed in the year 1857 when Indian soldiers in the British Army known as sepoys began to revolt. This was mainly due to the reason that the British forced the Indian sepoys to use cartridges made of pig and cow fat. However, most of these soldiers were either Muslim or Hindus, so they weren't allowed to do it. In any case, all across the Indian subcontinent, Indian sepoys began mutinying against their officers. The biggest contributor was Mangal Pandey. He rallied the soldiers and helped to defeat some of the British. However, he was executed. Other contributors was the queen of the Jhansi kingdom known as Lakshmi Bai and the Mughal emperor, which still existed but was a constitutional monarchy at this point, known as Bahadur Shah Zafar. However, Lakshmi Bai was killed and Bahadur Shah Zafar was exiled to Burma. All of this left the East India Company powerless, even when they defeated the Indian rebels. So, Britain themselves took over the Indian subcontinent. Instead of ruling through the East India Company, this time they ruled through viceroys, who were appointed governors of the Indian subcontinent. Just a few years later, the Queen of Britain, Queen Victoria, would be declared as the Empress of India. In the year 1885, the Indian National Congress was made. It was not originally made to gain independence, but rather to support the equality of British and Indian men. However, later, the people wanted independence, so in 1905, they launched the Swadeshi movement. In the Swadeshi movement, many British goods were boycotted and burned. Instead of directly assaulting the British, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, who was the father of the Swadeshi movement, went for peaceful protests instead. These were known as satyagrahas. It was at this time that many other freedom fighters arose and rose against the British. In 1919, the Rowlatt Act was born. Because of this law, any British could arrest any Indian who he or she found suspicious, without a trial. In the same year, the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy occurred. When civilians were having a town gathering, General Dyer ordered his troops to fire at them. Many men, women, and children died in the massacre. Many of the freedom fighters were fighting for the entire Indian subcontinent to be united under independence. However, one revolutionary known as Muhammad Ali Jinnah worked for a separate Islamic state. The country would later become Pakistan. At first, Muhammad Ali Jinnah founded the Muslim League, and he, with the revolutionaries, fought against the British. But later on, Hindus and Muslims would have a conflict in which thousands would die. The most influential of the revolutionaries was Gandhi. In 1930, he led the Dandi March, otherwise known as the Salt March. It was a protest in order to stop being taxed on salt. In 1935, the Government of India Act was passed. It was a final attempt to restore British India. During this time, the revolutionaries Chandrasekhar Azad and Bhagat Singh sought to end the British rule through violence. However, this failed, although it weakened the British government. In 1942, Gandhi led a peaceful protest known as the Quit India Movement in 1942. He protested against Indian soldiers participating in World War II along British soldiers, and he also wanted immediate independence. More freedom fighters such as Nehru and Vallabhbhai Patel, joined Gandhi in this act. By this time, independence was inevitable. Finally, in August 15, 1947, India gained independence. However, a separate Islamic state, with Muhammad Ali Jinnah as its leader, called Pakistan, was created. Modern day Bangladesh was not independent yet, so it became part of Pakistan. It became East Pakistan. However, this would soon lead to a mass migration and later a lot of bloodshed and violence. Many Hindus that were living in Pakistan before the separation were forced to go into India, and many Muslims in India had to go to Pakistan. During the mass migration, many Hindus and Muslims were killed. In the mass migration that followed, many were killed and many were also separated. Before the mass migration, Gandhi tried to convince Jinnah to unite Pakistan and India. Otherwise, violence would occur. However, these attempts failed. Even now, India and Pakistan have many political issues. In my first video about the History of India series, I mentioned that I will not explain anything after the independence of India. However, I will give a brief timeline of what happened after. In 1948, Gandhi was assassinated, and a few years after that, the remaining states were annexed. In the 1950s and 60s, India had a few wars with Pakistan and China. And in 1971, East Pakistan became Bangladesh. From the 1980s to 2000, new technology developed. That will conclude the entire History of India series.